angel of Gnosis is speaking to Zostrianos and says, "Why have you gone mad as though you were ignorant of the great eternal beings who are above? Never ever become destructive, nor pay attention to those you are familiar with. Do you suppose you're the father of your kind, or that Iolaus is your father? You have a divine angel who has shown you the way through holy persons. Come and transcend these realms. You will return to them another time to proclaim a living race to those who are worthy and to empower the chosen." It's anybody's game here. Zostrianos or Zostrianos is a very famous Persian sage in antiquity. He is so ancient and so learned. He's not Zoroastrian, but he's the grandfather of Zoroaster. So he's pre-Zoroastrian. And we know that Sethian Christians in the 4th century sort of split up into various groups. Some were continued to be called Sethians, some were called Archontics. And these smaller Sethian circles continued to exist in the region of Syria and Egypt, probably in very small communities in the 5th and 6th century. So, this gets us very close to the advent of Islam in Egypt. One of the first places that the Muslims go as they take over Egypt. So one of their first introductions to Christianity is that very distinctive Egyptian Christianity.
Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. And I'm with Dr. M. David Litwa, returning, who is a regular on this show. Everyone loves seeing him here. The comments seem to be very good. And if you haven't joined by now, join the Patreon. I'm showing it on the screen right now. It is a treasure chest of knowledge, of gnosis, of real gnosis, from a scholarly position that you're not going to find anywhere else. He's got videos that are locked for certain degrees of his Patreon, and you want to check those out. Click on the link in the description. Join the Patreon as low as $3 up to different degrees, and you'll get different things for what you pay for. It's all worth it. And if I'm not mistaken, there's a book deal happening right now, if I'm not mistaken, for a limited time offer. Do you want to tell them about that?
Yeah, hello everyone. Good to see you. So I offer codes on the Patreon for at least 3 of my books where you can get 20% off. And if you sign up to tier 3, you can get a free PDF of my first book, which is still like $136 on Amazon. Wow. And if you bump up to tier 5, I can send you a print copy of your selection of 5 of my most recent books. So some of these, actually, you'll get a better deal by buying them through the Patreon than by buying them through Amazon, because the academic publishers are crazy in their prices. Yeah. So yeah, come join. But yeah, the main thing is we've got videos on almost every text in the Nag Hammadi library and on all the so-called Gnostic figures in the 2nd century based on the Found Christianity's book that recently came out. So yeah, come join.
And just to reiterate, you're getting books that are $100 on Amazon for a deduction, a huge deduction, while also getting access to videos about Gnosticism, about the Nag Hammadi texts, about comparative religion, origins of Christianity, and you'll have it all in one place. And it'll be it's just a deal you can never find anywhere else, from a scholarly position as well. But yeah, today we have a special presentation on Zostrianos. Is that how I pronounce it?
Yeah, well, it's anybody's game here. Zostrianos or Zostrianos is a very famous Persian sage in antiquity. He is so ancient and so learned that he is actually he's not Zoroastrian, but he's the grandfather of Zoroaster. So he's even he's
Wow,
pre-Zoroastrian.
I didn't even know that.
Um, and he is a sage that early Christians appealed to, and his name is attached to one of the longest, if not the longest, text in the Nag Hammadi library, and that's what we'll discuss today. So I'd like to start these sessions with just a taster from the book. So here goes. In this scene, the angel of Gnosis is speaking to Zostrianos and says, "Why have you gone mad as though you were ignorant of the great eternal beings who are above? Never ever become destructive, nor pay attention to those you are familiar with. Do you suppose you're the father of your kind, or that Iolaus is your father? You have a divine angel who has shown you the way through holy persons. Come and transcend these realms. You will return to them another time to proclaim a living race to those who are worthy and to empower the chosen." Unquote. So let's look at some of the basic facts in this particular treatise. First of all, in the Nag Hammadi library, this is the first treatise in Codex 8. It is next to the obviously Christian treatise called the Letter of Peter to Philip. It is interestingly mentioned as one of the very treatises that were read and criticized in Plotinus's seminar in the mid 260s at Rome. So this is the very first time we hear of Zostrianus being received and read. So we know that it exists by the mid 260s, and we know that it's used in a philosophy seminar and highly criticized by Plotinus. It is one of the four quote unquote Platonizing Sethian treatises, as it's called by John D. Turner. So this group of four includes Zostrianos, Marsanes, Allegenes, and the Three Steels of Seth. And I'll have videos of all four on the Patreon. The genre is personal ascent apocalypse. So, like the book of Revelation in the New Testament, this is an apocalyptic text in which a seer goes on you might call it, a mystical journey. And what's different about Zostrianus is as he goes up to heaven, he doesn't encounter the traditional sort of 3, 7, or 10 heavens that we find in the Jewish and Christian apocalypses. He goes essentially through the Neoplatonic levels and spheres. Everything has been Neoplatonized, so that essentially there is a set of newly named spheres and realms that he goes through, and we'll talk about these later. As I mentioned, we know from Arnobius, who's a Christian writer around the year 300, that Zostrianus was considered to be the grandfather of Zoroaster or Zarathustra, who is Persian. So he's obviously pre-Mosaic. And what is happening here is that someone who is ever writing this treatise this is obviously a pseudepigraphon that is under a false name, but they're trying to reach back to not only pre-Christian wisdom, but also pre-Jewish wisdom. And that's an interesting intellectual move. So if we look at the plot, this is important because some of the text is fragmentary. What we find is that Zostrianus is a seer, and he has all these very difficult metaphysical questions that he asks people, and they don't have answers. And So Zostrianus, after this long sort of intellectual and philosophical journey, basically turns suicidal. Somewhat like Jesus, he enters into the desert and fasts, basically, so that he's so weak he plans to be devoured by wild animals. But lo and behold, he's met by a figure called the Angel of Gnosis, who guides him on a heavenly ascent past a series of levels, super heavenly, and super heavenly levels, variously named. He goes past the moon, which is called the airy earth, and the various astral spheres into realms that are called repentances and sojourns, up into the level of the divine intellect, which is divided at the lowest level into 4 luminaries, and finally going up until the Barbello Eon. And Barbello is the name of the super intellect in Sethian Christian thought. And Zostrianus goes through a series of transmogrifications or transformations, but eventually he does return to his mortal body, which he has left in the charge of angels or glories, and he comes back to preach enlightenment and deification to people on earth with what is perhaps my favorite line of the text, where Zostrianus says, "Awaken your godhead or godhood in God, and empower your sinless elect soul." Now, one of the real reasons that I like Zostrianus, and which I've had opportunity to talk about in my book, Post-Human Transformation, is because it's our best access to what might be called Gnostic Angelification. That is, that view of salvation in which we become angels, and at various levels. So, quite interestingly, Zostrianus literally takes on the image of the glories when he leaves his body on earth. And glories is a sort of Jewish sounding code name for angels. But then this becomes very explicit when Zostrianus gets to the level of the 4 luminaries. He takes on a series of angelic identities. He's called a contemplative angel. Then he transforms into a masculine angel, then into a holy angel, then into a perfect angel. And then finally, when he reaches the Barbello Eon, he becomes an angel of the intelligible world, which is also synonymous with a God of truth. And this is when Zostrianus reaches the highest level or degree of existence. And he becomes completely and utterly bodiless, away from any sort of vehicle that contains his intellect. He simply becomes pure intellect. And as pure intellect, he is then able to experience undifferentiated union with the higher intellect, or Barbello, who is viewed as the Virgin Mother of the saints. And what's interesting is the way that Zostrianus gets these transformations is at each transformation, he goes through a baptism. And he's actually baptized, I think, for a full number of 22 times as he goes through the various levels. So this is obviously something to consider when you're thinking about is this a Christian text? And we'll get to that issue momentarily. A lot of people will say that this isn't a Christian text. And what's important to keep in mind is, obviously, in terms of the nature of the text, the author is pretending to be a Persian sage who is living thousands of years before Jesus. Okay, so it wouldn't really be very logical for him to be mentioning Jesus or Christ left and right, because essentially the life of Jesus hasn't happened yet and won't happen for another few thousand years. So when you're writing a pseudepigraphon and you're pretending to be somewhat a sage who is thousands of years old, you're not going to be referring to Jesus. But we know that the first users of the texts were those whom Porphyry calls Christians, and he calls them heretics from Platonism. So they were both Platonists and Christians. In the text, we find distinctive Christian features. So daimones, which became demons, they're all viewed negatively as far as we can see. This is a Christian feature because Platonists viewed daimones as not as evil, but as sort of ambiguous beings that could be good or bad on occasion. The many baptisms, the 22 baptisms that I mentioned, are generally seen as positive rites of transformation. And there's one passage where Zostrianus refers to a baptism of death, and this refers to other people's baptism, possibly other Christians. But in general, Zostrianus is overwhelmingly positive about baptism. That's the primary means of transformation in the heavens. There's a reference to faith, hope, and love that are associated with the first three luminaries, and these are three theological virtues that appear in 1 Corinthians 13. So there's a knowledge of Paul. There's also a reference to a being who suffers unsufferingly, which is a common way for Christians later to refer to Jesus. And there's a coded reference to Jesus by the double mention of a figure called Jesus Mazareus Yesidecus, which is a mystical name which apparently can be translated Jesus of Nazareth, the Just One. And Dylan Burns, I was reminded of this morning, says that another Christian feature of this text is that Zostrianus goes through a level of heaven called the sojourn or perichesis in Greek. And although in Jewish texts the sojourn, or sometimes thought of as a negative exile, is negative, in Christian texts the sojourn are words about sojourning are almost always positive, as they are in Zostrianus. So here's 7 reasons why you should consider this, I think, a Christian text, even though, yes, Jesus is never mentioned openly. So I think I've said enough to sort of whet your appetite. What I always, encourage everybody to do is to, pick up a copy of the Nag Hammadi library. I use the Nag Hammadi Scriptures as a basic intro text. Go to Codex 8 and read Zostrianus for yourself. What I can basically summarize here, from my point of view, Zostrianus is a pseudepigraphical Christian apocalypse written in the first half of the 3rd century by a Scythian Christian deeply informed by the latest currents of Platonism. So for further reading on Zostrianus, we've got, in terms of scholarly literature, we've got Michael Williams' book called The Immovable Race, John D. Turner's massive book, Scythian Gnosticism and the Platonic Tradition. Dylan Burns, some of you know, has a section relevant to Zostrianus in his book, Apocalypse of an Alien God. And I'll just throw in my own book called Post-Human Transformation, where I've got a chapter on Angelification in Zostrianus. So go check those resources out. This is the scholarly literature, which is going to be the more accurate stuff that you want to be looking at. And obviously, I'm happy to take further comments and questions on the Patreon. And if you're interested in Scythian Christianity, you can check out, we did an episode here on the Apocryphon of John. And I'm dealing with all the rest of the Scythian literature on the Patreon. So hop on the Patreon and you'll get introductions to every single Scythian treatise. And I hope you'll join.
Absolutely. There's a lot there. This is really fascinating stuff right here. I really wanted to ask you if you think that there's any connection or possibly a influence on later becoming Islam, like a movement of Christianity, sort of, but being influenced by these people or the same people, and then that trickling down to what happens in the 7th century of Islam.
Yeah, well, it's sometimes challenging to draw, lines of genetic connection because we're dealing with a third century text, and Islam comes 4 centuries later. But we surmise, so the way we know about Zostrianus is that it was either written in Egypt or it reached Egypt by the 4th century. And we know that Sethian Christians in the 4th century sort of split up into various groups. Some were continued to be called Sethians, some were called Archontics, and they had various other names. And these smaller Sethian circles continued to exist in the region of Syria and Egypt, probably in very small communities in the 5th and 6th century. So, this gets us very close to the advent of Islam in Egypt. One of the first places that the Muslims go is they take over Egypt. So one of their first introductions to Christianity is that very distinctive Egyptian Christianity. And so, yeah, I think you could definitely, and we'd need to study this further, but you could definitely see lines of influence. Definitely, we just need to bring in an expert in like the 5th, 6th, 7th century Egypt to tell us more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing, this is more of a comment that I maybe want to hear your thoughts on, is that I'm not surprised to see sort of Zoroastrians mixing with Christians, especially when you look at, for example, Matthew 4. There's a passage about Jesus going into the wilderness where he's tempted by the devil. Now, this term devil doesn't show up. This is the first time we hear about this devil. There's no devil. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think there's a devil in the Old Testament, right? I think this is the first time
Well,
we see
there's a figure called Ha-Satan, which is
the
translated
accuser.
Diabolus in
Oh, okay.
in Job, and Diabolus
Really? I did not know that. Interesting.
is just means the slenderer. And yeah, I'll have to check my Greek translation of Job, but I do believe that's how Ha-Satan is translated in Job.
Wow.
But yeah, in terms of I mean, the Christians do innovate a little bit on their version of the devil, so there is something to say there. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, what I was getting at is that in the Zendavesta, there's a passage with Zoroaster doing the same thing. He's in the wilderness. He's chanting to Ahura Mazda, and then he's rushed upon by Angr Manu. And Angr Manu says to him, "Let go of your worship of the Holy One, and I'll give you the boon of all boons." He says, "The boon to rule all nations, the same as the murderer." Basically saying, "I'll give you what the murderer gets. You could rule." I don't know why they phrase it that way. It's probably some linguistic thing, but that's what it says. And me, as someone who was a Christian, when I'm reading this for the first time, I'm like, pause it. This sounds like something I know. And I'm not saying they copied or anything. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying I think there might have been some sort of maybe an influence, maybe maybe drawing from a sort of the passage. But if I'm not mistaken, also Angr Manu is depicted as sort of a devil character with horns, if I'm not mistaken.
That I don't know.
Okay.
I mean, he's obviously the evil spirit par
Yeah.
excellence. Yeah, I'd say if you want like the adaptation of Zoroastrian mythology into Christian mythology, I think Matthew is not a bad place to start because he's the only Christian writer to bring in the Magi. And I have a chapter on the Magi in How the Gospels Became History, which is a book I published about 3 years ago. And I go through Zoroaster's birth from a virgin, and I compare that with Matthew. So yeah, there could be additional connections there with praying in the desert.
I'll have to send you the passages I'm talking about and see what you think about it. That way you can
Sure.
maybe you can post it on Patreon. That's what we can do. So for whoever's watching this, if you want to see the continuation of this, of my question that I just posed right now, if you want to see a scholar take a look at this and give his opinion, go to patreon.com, M.Div Litwa, and you will get the answer. So that's a funny thing. That we didn't plan that out. That's just
I'll do my best.
Yeah, I'll send you that, and then whenever you get a chance. But okay. So the Simon Magus worship cult, whatever it was that was happening in Rome, do you see any similar thing going on with that movement as this movement? Is there similarities?
Well, that's an interesting question. So the one who reports about the Simonians in Rome is Justin Martyr, who's writing about 150. And we hear of the Sethians in Rome in the 260s. So it's a century later. We really don't know what happens in the intervening period with the Simonians. I certainly wish that we did. But for those of you who are wanting to get more of Simonian doctrine, you can check out I have a Patreon video on the Great Declaration, which is our sole surviving Simonian source, joined with the concept of our great power. The concept of our great power is probably written by a Simonian, and that's in Nag Hammadi, and that's also on the Patreon. So our sources there, are very slim. And honestly, I don't have a good answer because we don't know what happened to the Simonians in Rome. But Simonian theology is sufficiently different from Sethian theology to make me think that, we're dealing with two different groups of people.
Sure.
They obviously may have talked to each other, but we don't know.
Sure. And then there's the Manichaeans. Is this central to the Manichaeans are after this, right?
Yeah, so Mani is actually becomes active in this period, and he has a Persian or Iranian father. So and then he's raised in an Alkasite community, which has Christian features. So if you're looking for the actual hybrid religion of Christianity and Zoroastrian thought, that would be Manichaeism, and that's being invented right in the 3rd century.
Interesting. It's very fascinating. Yeah, that should do it for me for now. And if anyone else has any questions, join the Patreon, and you will have direct access to the answer to the great sage M.Div Litwa. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, you should join it.
Maybe Zoroaster or Zostrianos can help us both. Yes. But yeah, I'm just a mediator.
Yes. Well, you have just attained true gnosis.
You have just attained true gnosis. The demiurge has no power over you.